The Middle Ages, a time full of mysteries, epic battles, and totally bizarre practices that will make you thankful for living in the 21st century. If you think medieval history is just about castles and knights, it's time to find out what really went on behind the scenes of this era. Get ready to learn some of the 5 bizarre and even disgusting facts about the Middle Ages that will leave anyone breathless. From rare bats and unbelievable cures for diseases to the most disgusting meals possible, you'll be surprised by what medievalists had to endure to survive. Let's go! 1. Baths. Only if it were rare. Imagine living in the Middle Ages. We're not talking about a magical castle with a warm shower and bubble bath, but a world where taking a bath was practically an unbelievable luxury. You, who today can go to the bathroom and turn on the hot water as if it was something completely normal, will now understand what it was like to live in a time when water, believe it or not, was seen as something dangerous. And I'm not exaggerating, no. People in the Middle Ages really believed that water could open the pores of the skin and leave the body vulnerable to diseases. Yes, it sounds crazy, but for them, being wet was not healthy. And this idea was so strong that if you were lucky, you could take a bath once a year. Now, think about it. How did people clean themselves back then? If you imagine something a little more bizarre, you're right. Instead of bathing with soap and water, the most common thing was to clean the body with dry cloths. It was a basic trick. A cloth was rubbed over the skin, trying to remove dirt, and often the cloth was slightly impregnated with vinegar or oils. The idea was to remove body odor and try to prevent diseases. Of course, in practice, the smell didn't magically disappear, and the feeling of cleanliness, well, let's just say it was quite relative. In fact, the unique smell of the Middle Ages would be something quite difficult to describe. But if you were part of that time, you would probably notice that the air was much denser with unpleasant odors. Imagine the mix of sweat, traces of food, and of course the smell of people who had never seen a shower in their lives. And if you think that was bad, there's also the exclusive side of bathing. If you were a nobleman, you might have access to more frequent baths. But even so, that didn't mean you would be immersed in clean, perfumed water. Bathing was often a ritual for the rich, more for status reasons than anything else. However, contrary to what we think today, taking a bath was not seen as a form of hygiene, but almost as a luxury of comfort in a world where the focus was, in fact, survival. Now, believe me, this is getting even more bizarre. For the lower classes, bathing rarely happened. And if one day you managed to gather the courage and energy to wash yourself, it was possible that you would have to do it with a bucket of cold water. And that was it. Second medieval toothbrush, fingers and a piece of cloth. In the Middle Ages, you could hardly count on a toothbrush or any other type of suitable tool to keep your mouth healthy. In fact, most people used what was most accessible, their fingers or pieces of cloth. The person would take their finger and rub it on their teeth, trying to remove the dirt. And if they were a little more sophisticated, they could even use a damp cloth to do the same. And as if that weren't bizarre enough, it's worth remembering that people had no idea that oral hygiene was essential for general health. For them, the mouth was just a detail, and what really mattered was survival. Even the upper classes of medieval society weren't very concerned with what was going on inside the mouth. Dentists, well, they didn't even exist. And if you happened to have a serious dental problem, such as cavities or unbearable pain, the solution was quite simple. Either you suffered in silence, or if you were lucky, someone would try to pull your tooth out with improvised tools such as iron pliers. Imagine the pain. And the worst part, teeth could rot quickly because without care and without any idea of what was happening, oral diseases were super common. Medieval people used to use bizarre remedies, such as a powder made from animal bones or herbs that promised to cure oral diseases. It almost seems like the mouth was considered a somewhat forgotten place, doesn't it? Well, a reality that is at least shocking for us who today are so accustomed to modern care. 3. The cure for the Black Death? Smoke and urine. Now, if you think oral hygiene practices in the Middle Ages were bizarre, wait until you hear about the treatments for the Black Death, the disease that devastated Europe in a devastating way. In the 14th century, and look, when I say bizarre, I'm being very kind. The Black Death was responsible for the deaths of millions of people, and in the midst of widespread panic, doctors and healers were completely at a loss as to how to deal with the situation. But instead of seeking scientific solutions, what they did was, well, incredibly strange. Instead of vaccines or proper medicines, which, let's face it, didn't even exist at the time, the cure to ward off the Black Death was basically to try to mask the disease with strong smells. And what smells? Many people believe that the city's contaminated air was the main cause of the plague. So in order to purify the environment, they burned all kinds of materials, from garlic to animal feces. What is most impressive is that these practices were followed by many without any questioning, as if they were the only viable alternatives. The idea was that the smoke from these items would have the power to clean the air and therefore ward off the plague. A street filled with smoke from burning feces with the smell of garlic mixed with rot. I don't know about you, but to me this sounds more like an olfactory nightmare than a health solution. If you had some purchasing power, you could try a sophisticated treatment. But between us, this was almost as shocking as the use of burning feces. One of the most sought after cures by those who had money was bathing in cow urine. That's right, urine baths. Believe it or not, people believed that cow urine had miraculous healing properties. And if that weren't enough, the process would be repeated over and over again in the hope that somehow the disease would be warded off by, well, the strong smell of urine. I don't know about you, but the idea of curing a disease with this kind of bath definitely doesn't sit well with my stomach. And what happened when neither the smoke nor the cow urine worked? Well, they didn't give up. More smoke, more incense, more urine baths. The important thing was to keep at it until they found something that somehow worked. And of course, there was always the simplest remedy, the smoke cigar used anywhere at any time. During this period, mental illness was not seen as something related to the brain or behavior. No, in fact, people believed that the true cause of these conditions lay in something much darker, the evil that possessed the person. The treatment for these illnesses could be quite inhumane. What do you mean? Exorcisms and torture, of course. Imagine living in a time where if you started acting a little differently, if you had a panic attack or simply didn't fit into society's expectations, you would quickly be labeled as possessed or possessed by a demon. There was not even a concept of mental illness as we understand it today, and symptoms were treated based on what medieval culture thought was the explanation for everything. Exorcisms were then one of the most common treatments. And we're not talking about a gentle prayer or a quiet prayer. No, what happened was an extremely intense ritual with prayers, screams, and even physical aggression in an attempt to expel the demon. If the person did not improve, well, the solution was to continue with the rituals, or in the most extreme case, to put the person under torture, believing that the suffering would help to purify the person's soul and drive away evil spirits. The torture could be physical and psychological, since it was believed that the body needed to be forced to expel evil. And for this to happen, suffering was essential. There were no doctors to diagnose or treat these disorders of the mind, much less an understanding of how the brain works. This view was so deeply rooted in the medieval mentality that even the doctors of the time, who somehow understood more about the human body, could not avoid this type of treatment. There was no idea that mental illnesses could have physical causes such as chemical imbalances or psychological trauma. For doctors, the body was immersed in a world of mysteries, and therefore the most logical thing was to resort to religious or physical practices to resolve any deviation from normal behavior. 5. The horror of medieval food. If you think that food in the Middle Ages was a simple matter of taste or tradition, prepare to be surprised. Food at the time was much more about survival than pleasure, and with that came some extremely bizarre and yes, disgusting practices. Imagine living in a period without refrigerators, without efficient methods of preserving food, and with hygiene being a distant concern. Result? Foods that nowadays we wouldn't even think about touching were consumed without the slightest remorse. Meat, for example, was one of the main foods, but due to the lack of adequate techniques to preserve it, it did not always arrive at the table fresh. And when I say not always fresh, I mean that often the meat was already in the process. of decomposing. Of course, people at the time had no idea how bacteria worked, and the concept of contaminated or spoiled food was a distant one. So instead of wasting it, they simply used what they had, namely rotten meat. But of course, none of this would be so palatable if there weren't creative ways to camouflage the taste and smell of spoiled meat. And that's where hearty soups come into play. To disguise the stench of decay, people prepared heavy soups with strong seasonings and spices that seemed more like an invitation to the sense of smell to get used to what was being served. Or they opted for roasts that, in addition to being seasoned with whatever they had available, were also a way of hiding the smell of old meat as a way of embalming the flavor. But the main dish most of the time was nothing more than meat that was literally in an advanced stage of being inedible. Nothing like a good medieval banquet, right? And if you think that's enough to make anyone lose their appetite, wait until you see what else was on the menu. Rat soups, for example, were extremely common. Rodents, which were often ubiquitous, were hunted and turned into a popular dish, especially among the lower classes. And with the lack of hygiene in all aspects of medieval life, it's not hard to imagine that these soups weren't exactly clean. The worst thing is that in a society where the concept of cleanliness was far from ideal, no one thought twice before eating these rodents, transformed into food, accompanied by a hot and seasoned broth. Rotten meat, rats, unappetizing soups, and banquets were part of the harsh reality of a time when survival was more important than enjoying a tasty meal. And so we come to the end of this journey through the incredible medieval world where things were not exactly as we are used to today. The lack of hygiene, the bizarrely cruel treatments, and the food that defies the logic of any human being. With a minimum of good taste were just some of the aspects of a time when survival was the priority and science and medicine were far from what we know today. From rare baths and exorcisms for mental illnesses to rat soups and rotten meat, the Middle Ages were definitely not for the faint of heart. Now the question remains, if you lived in the Middle Ages, which of these treatments would you find the hardest to deal with? Living without baths, having to eat rotten meat, or being treated with exorcisms and torture for a simple mental illness? Leave your comment below. We want to know what you think and which of these medieval stories shocked you the most.